see everybody here with another one of those really big Tengridomes that sort of go beyond the scope of usual, fight breakdowns and that kind of stuff. But this time, instead of discussing analysis or like talking about the idea of analyzing fights, we're mostly just gonna delve into one of those topics that sort of nagged me about MMA for a while now, and I've got a bunch of like-minded people who were also kind of annoyed by this subject for quite a while now, and we're just gonna, it's gonna be one of those discussions about ethics and concepts and ideas, and it's if you're uninterested in that kind of stuff, then you probably should just turn it off, because we're gonna go on for like probably 2 hours about this. And the idea today is what we're gonna discuss today is not fiction, but the idea of traditional masculinity as it's perceived in the world of combat sports, and how it's been affected by factors outside of combat sports, like stuff like politics and all the bullshit culture war talking points and all that kind of stuff. To just get this right out of the way, to set the tone, so to speak, I am of the opinion that the idea of traditional masculinity commonly espoused by modern conservatives that has been picked up by the UFC and UFC fans is complete fiction. And we're going to be sort of like calling back to some of the episodes that we've had on concepts like the idea of toughness in combat sports, or like how culture and institutions affect combat sports. And those were discussion panels that we've had that featured martial artists, coaches, analysts, and actual active fighters. So if you're interested in hearing our thoughts regarding these topics, we're going to touch upon them briefly, but just go back and listen to those episodes. There's also the Savage Mountain Men episode of Tengridome. It's a solo episode, and I talked about how all these papajahead weirdos just sort of like have created this idea of why fighters from the Caucasus and other post-Soviet regions are so effective. It's mostly just rooted in all the stereotypes that they have about the region, as opposed to, actual factual knowledge that they actually, went out of their way to seek out. And so this is probably going to take, this is probably just going to be a series of episodes exploring this topic, but this one is going to be just sort of laying the groundwork for that kind of stuff. So we'll examine the common talking points brought up by fight fans, deconstruct them using historical examples, compare and contrast the masculine values of different cultures, like based in fact, we're going to basically just try to facts and logic this crowd that really loves abusing the idea of facts and logic to just promote their agenda. And we're just going to take all that and compare and contrast them with the modern idea of a tough manly man, and the idea of a tough manly man that is endemic to the vocal, the very outspoken part of UFC fans that's just kind of like falling somewhere near all those outright return to tradition masculinity weirdos that have been they're just dime a dozen right now on the internet. Folks like Andrew Tate, Liver King, etc. You know what I'm talking about. If you're any sort of if you're online these days, you probably came across some of them. You probably, even the algorithms on social media right now just sort of kind of, they kind of let this content seep into your feed. If you log on to YouTube, you start looking for like Korean spicy chicken recipe. You watch the Korean spicy chicken recipe, and then suddenly the next video is something like, here's how hunter-gatherers traditionally ate organ meat raw back in in 5000 BC or something like that. So we're gonna touch briefly upon that, and Just the idea of this, how I would put it is, I would put it as the weaponization of the masculine ideal for political and propaganda purposes, and just the way modern online grifters, as well as political figures and forces, use it to propagate their agenda. And for that purpose, I'm joined today by my usual co-host for these big episodes, Haxxorized, and also friend of the site, Simon Amorim, who was also featured on the alternate commentary we did for Max Holloway versus Volkanovski 3. Or Volkanovski versus Max Holloway 3, the third fight, which you can check out on our Patreon. Anyway, hello, folks.
Hello.
Hello. We should give a shout out because Simon's knowledge of all things movies, and thus movies like Taxi Driver, means he has an intimate understanding of what incels want. He's very well read on these things.
I mean, we will bring up all that stuff. Yeah, that's partially why I brought Simon on board, because he's a big, movie guy. And, I mean, it's been kind of a sort of a very contentious talking point in online discourse about movies like Fight Club, Taxi Driver, Tar, the recent example that you brought up in the discussion we've had before starting the recording.
Yeah, I've seen all I've seen all 6,000 movies in the angry white guy kills a lot of people. So I don't know how many of those I've seen. It's a lot. They make a lot of those movies. Yeah. Anyways, it's good to be on. We don't get to do this often. It's a bit of a dark topic in some ways, but I think we can bring some positive things out of this.
I mean, we'll try.
Yeah, we'll try.
Yeah, every time I want to bring up someone, it's just bring someone on board. It's always like, oh, you're going to have me talk about the cool fights that we watched and all the nice, interesting stuff that I know. Like, no, you're going to talk about insults and rape.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, anyway, so just to just sort of restate our credentials once again, so the listeners know what we're going to bring to the table. Yeah, credentials, quote unquote, just basically just stuff we know.
I am a man.
Yes. I am a guy. Sometimes I get horny, but it doesn't turn me into a rapey domestic abuser. So that is my credentials.
Wow, talk about a soy.
But yeah, basically why I want to examine this from a cultural standpoint is that I grew up in a tiny Siberian village. I'm one of those, I'm probably as close as it gets in the modern world to one of those, hunter-gatherer societies that the modern online grifters like just glamorize left and right. Yeah. But yeah,
I just have a level 100 fletching.
Yeah. Yes. Essentially, yeah. I mean, I grew up like mostly like just doing hard manual labor on a farm in Siberia.
I won't have any more RuneScape references, I promise.
While I may not live in that type of a society anymore, I did spend a fair amount of time growing up and as a young adult on the frontier as well. And it fucking sucks,
Yeah.
There's nothing quite like listening to some white guy who has, lived in the comfort of a first world society their entire life, telling you how manly and, life-shaping it is to feel that if Granddad walked down and smashed his hip, he'd probably bleed to death, before the ambulance got there, if there even is an ambulance or equivalent.
There's probably a cart. There's probably like a horse cart. And there's
or a family road trip, in that one car that you've managed to resurrect, like Bush Mechanics from that ABC TV series.
Just a shitbox falling apart at the seams.
So I think it would be a good idea to, state the obvious here, which is that there's been events in the sphere, the orbit of combat sports over the last 3 months that have really made it kind of obvious of a thing to talk about, which is the problem of the way men act and are looked at in this area. And this has always been a problem in MMA. There's always been domestic abusers in combat sports. There's always been misogyny, but there's been some quite public displays and discourse around it. And I think that's why we thought it was important to do this now.
It's not like it's a problem that is unique to MMA, but it's a problem that is just manifests itself in very interesting ways. By interesting, I mean embarrassing, but it's like, by and large, we could probably say that, for example, in other more well-established sports, like, for example, like NFL, sure, they could be doing a better job of like punishing domestic abusers and all that kind of stuff, but in MMA, it doesn't. In NFL, the whole fan base doesn't come out in defense of a player that just hit his wife in public, or it doesn't say that anyone who is trying to condemn this person is actually, like, you know, soy pilled or a weakling or any other sort of bullshit that's the MMA fans like to say.
Yeah. I mean, you do get a lot of that, but it feels like in MMA, it's the pro beating your wife's side feels quite dominant compared to, and there's no media apparatus to kind of hold people in power to any sort of account, like when, you know, a NFL star, you know, is caught hitting his wife. There's, you know, constant news run, 24 hours on ESPN, Stephen A. Smith talking about it. Yeah. And then Dana White, it happens, and it's kind of like a 6-hour news thing, and he's holding a slap fighting event a week from then, and it plays on TBS, which shows sitcoms mostly and game shows.
On top of everything else that the both of you have said, MMA is also a sport where the person who is not necessarily the brains or the heart of the operation, but the public face, says, "Oh, you're done with us, boy. Your career's done with us if you ever hit a woman," and is then on record hitting a woman, and the consequences that he suffers for it are zero. So it's not just the fact that, you know, it seems to be okay to hit a woman in MMA, or it seems to be okay to use, you know, physical force that isn't proportional to the situation against somebody that's weaker with you, if you want a technical answer, rolling my fucking eyes. But the fact that the guy who, you know, set the own moral standard doesn't even hold himself to his own moral standard, I mean, that says a lot about the totally broken space we kind of exist in.
Yeah, just the events that prompted this episode, obviously, like the big one is Dana White slapping his wife, Dana White defense force coming out in, you know, force. Phil Baroni fucking beat his girlfriend to death shortly after that, and Andrew Tate finally got his stupid ass arrested, which prompted just like a number of prominent MMA fighters to come out in force and express solidarity with a known sex trafficker, and everyone is just like, how can you prove that Andrew Tate is a sex trafficker? What happened to the presumption of innocence? And like, Andrew Tate is fucking, look at his website. Just Google it. It's all up there. He's actually bragging about that, all the stuff that he did on his website.
The Andrew Tate stuff is so fascinating because in the real world, you get in trouble for sex trafficking. But in the masculine return to tradition online space, they're completely astounded that he has faced any kind of repercussion for his actions. And men get away with horrible things all the time, but you can't be an obvious idiot sex trafficker and just get away for it forever.
A nice parallel, I would say, that is just kind of showcases just how sheltered MMA fans are intellectually, is the reaction to the James Krause situation, where Jeff Molina is out there just implicating himself, both himself and James Krause, and all the criminal fraud that they have done with the selling of insider information regarding the state of MMA fighters coming into the cage.
He's a level above insider trafficking, also known as how to get your non-0.00001% ass blasted out of the courts faster than you can express your disappointment.
Yes, Jeff Molina just saying, it's like insider trading.
Yeah. On the Tate brothers, there's no shortage of clips you can go to in just fire up YouTube and look for analysis by lawyers saying, I'm not saying that this person is guilty. I'm saying that the statements that a certain tape brother has made publicly don't look very good. I would also add, just maybe as a point, I see a lot of people kind of push back on some of the points we're raising with, well, you shouldn't say anything until they've had their day in court. They're not officially guilty. And firstly, I point to what I just mentioned, listen to the opinions of professional lawyers with 20, 30 years experience in these matters saying, Andrew Tate should shut his fucking mouth. I wouldn't want him as a client. These are defense lawyers. These are people that would be looking for an opportunity to defend him if they thought it was a worthwhile case. But secondly, even if some of these situations are not guilty situations in a court of law for whatever reason, and please remember, not guilty should not be taken to mean innocent. They are two different things. Ask a fucking lawyer. We also need to ask ourselves, why do we keep ending up in this situation? Like, why do we continually have situations of accused domestic violence or intimidation or use of force and threats and so on? Even if not all of these are true, it at least seems to me that the incidence of this type of stuff happening in the combat sports sphere is much higher than it is in others. And that's important too.
Yeah, it's like
that's a perfect point, yeah.
Yeah, it just brings us to the question, like, what is the major malfunction? Why is MMA like this? Why are combat sports like this? Just why has combat sports become a space where most men believe that it's okay to hurt women? And why do such men gravitate towards MMA? And there are numerous factors that caused this situation to happen, have led to this situation developing. But yeah, let's just get into this whole thing and just examine the very specific point that I kind of just the reason why I brought everyone together for this episode. Just the myth of the real man that is very prominent nowadays in like frustrated young men communities. And combat sports is 100% is basically just the space where frustrated young men gather purely because of the nature of our sport.
Yeah, so I had a thought about this, which is about the feedback loop of toxic masculinity, if you want to call it that occurs in these spaces, which is there's an automatic association between combat, violence, strengths, physical attributes, and masculinity. This is one of the oldest, traits of masculinity is this connection to the warrior king and all this stuff, right? It's literally thousands of years old. And because of that, you get people coming into MMA with traditional views of masculinity and conservative views of masculinity that look at, things like ignorance and misogyny and all these negative traits as intrinsic to their identity. And they bring it into MMA. And those are the people who fight in MMA. And those are the people who own the MMA organizations and who are the coaches and who are the fans. And because the space is filled with these people, when you have new people come into the space, this is now the idol of masculinity to them, is the fighters who are like this, the owners who are like this, the fellow fans who are like this. And that ideology, that view of masculinity overtakes. And when masculinity is used as a way to identify yourself, which is totally fine, but you don't have the positive, constructive, wonderful things you could associate it with, and you only have the negative, you very quickly can get these horrible situations in which the entire community is a swamp of these negative traits. And you get situations like, a majority of online fans defending someone like Dana White. So that's kind of how I think we've gotten here a little bit. And we can get into the specifics of history and of fighters if you want.
I think some things I would talk about are institutions and boundary conditions, because I think a lot of people underestimate how very quickly, if you have two groups of people, so let's say two populations, let's say, I may be wrong on this, but let's say baseball fans, that doesn't strike me as a sport that's particularly pro-domestic violence, and then combat sports fans. You can start with these two groups of people having a very similar predisposition towards being okay with any type of violence, right? And you can have a few small changes, very small changes. If you think of both sides as groups of 100 people, so 100%, if you make even a 1 or 2% change in either's attitude towards something, and then another 1 or 2% change due to another factor, and then another factor, those differences can add up very quickly over time. For people that are a bit confused by that, go pick up a compound interest calculator and start seeing how quickly 5% becomes a really, really big number. Then try it with exponential interest. So like some examples of, boundary conditions that for me that would lead to, combat sports being more violent. Well, let's start with two really obvious ones. Number one, combat sports is about violence. That inherently means you're going to attract a crowd that are probably more comfortable with and perhaps more predisposed to not even violent solutions, but talking about violence, having a discussion about violence, and in some situations being prepared to use violence. Another example of something in combat sports spaces that comes to me as a really obvious one is people get hit. When you get hit a lot, particularly in MMA due to its very, very emphasis on hard sparring in a lot of camps, and we can see that also through a high degree of fighter injuries, that causes CTE. We know what CTE does to people's brains. And I want to make it clear that I'm not excusing things here. This is not an excuse for this behavior. Unacceptable behavior is unacceptable behavior. Rather, I'm trying to look at small environmental reasons that may make, an MMA or a combat sports personal community, 1 or 2% more likely to do violent things, and how that can add up quickly over time. And, also there's a kind of a glorification of violence, right? But that also crosses over into institutions. So the UFC as an organization, how often does it take action against its own people when they're guilty of, promoting violent behavior? I mean, what happened after, was it Leon Edwards and Jorge Masvidal got into a fight? That seemed to help out their careers, when two fighters punching on outside of a ring is the sort of thing they should be punished for. So I would say even a lot of the institutions within combat sports tend to reward people for being violent, or at least they don't punish them anywhere near hard enough. Another example would be Gervonta Davis. What real consequences has he faced in the boxing world for, his violent past? So when you put those two things together, the little, what I call boundary conditions or environmental changes that make, combat sports people just a bit more open to violence, and then you throw in the institutions not punishing people for being violent, I think you've got some very simple explanations that over a generation of fighters, 2 generations of fighters, 3 generations of fighters and their fans, and, MMA's been, UFC's been around, 25 years plus in a sense, it occupies the consciousness. That's enough time for a couple of generations. You can have that attitude build and develop into a rolling snowball over time. And then a lot of what Simon says happens, because then people outside of the space who aren't into the, the violence, and perhaps the violence that overlaps the domestic violence, they'll just leave because it's not a place for them.
Yeah, there's that point you brought up about the institution, and the thing about the institution of MMA, Dana White, the UFC, these organizations that almost always allow acts of domestic violence, acts of misogyny, unjustified fighting between people when it's not in the ring, right? That without punishment it preserves and protects those who do it. And if those people who do it are successful, these things that they've done, it doesn't hold them back. And what then happens is you get people that become convinced that these things he's done, the domestic violence, the misogyny, the fighting people outside the ring, this isn't just a thing they do and they're successful. It actually in some way is their success, is why they are successful, because they are like this. This is how you get people who think that John Jones is a great fighter because he's the type of person who will do a hit and run while high on cocaine. Like, that is somehow the type of person that is great at MMA. And if you want to be great at MMA, you need to be like John Jones, right? Or if you want to be great at MMA, you need to be this traditionally masculine, stoic, hyper-focused, emotionless, character to be good at fighting, right? And as soon as you stop punishing or having consequences for these actions, you can start getting people who start thinking that they're actually the cause of success. Gervonta Davis is a great boxer because he's a violent man who would hit his wife, and that just makes him vicious in the ring, right? Mike Tyson is a rapist, and that's the type of guy he is. And being that type of guy is why he was such a great boxer. Obviously, these things aren't true. These are horrifying, dark thoughts that a lot of people subconsciously and consciously believe in the MMA sphere, that this is what's necessary to being great or to being successful or to being talented. And I think we've all kind of come into this with our own ideas about what actually can your identity be where you're successful? What will actually make you better by associating yourself and trying to reach a proper ideal? And we can move on to that if anyone wants to.
I mean, yeah, to just sort of like piggyback off the thought that you started, the trail of thought that you started, is like this this misconception, these misconceptions that breed, that are just encouraged to breed in the MMA sphere, just based off ignorance and lack of actual critical thinking in regards to certain stereotypes. Like, for example, crazy savages and poverty fetishism are all the rage in the culture of MMA. Like, if you're a fighter from outside the US, then you're probably poor and uneducated, but that's what made you a good fighter. Same with being a fighter that is violent or a fighter that is prone to outbursts of rage. That's what made you a good fighter. Not finding a good gym with a good coach or training with other good folks.
Or being athletic or
MMA
the millions of other things.
Yeah, MMA fans are seemingly unable to comprehend that, for example, Brazil has cities in it, especially like in light of what the people were saying about Alex Pereira, for example. Like, their idea of a champion is like, for example, like a fighter from the Caucasus region. They don't think that fighters from Caucasus train in well-equipped gyms after their university classes. They think that they train on top of Mount Elbrus, bollock naked, from the age of 7, with bears swatting at their cheeks. And like the most prominent voices in MMA continue to yap on about hunter-gatherers and diets where you eat nothing but horse balls and bad dragon dildos without any hint of irony. And like, just the best example of this sort of like low-effort smart, as I like to call it, is Joe Rogan praising Marcus Aurelius for his modern-sounding English on one of the episodes when they were talking about what like a man should behave or like the ideas of masculinity. Like, it didn't occur to him that the actual treatise that he was reading was just translated that way. Just Marcus Aurelius wrote in modern-sounding English that is easy to comprehend back in the Roman times. That's what he thought. That's what his brain jumped to immediately, and that's kind of that tells you so much about the way that MMA fans think about a lot of these things.
A point that I'd really like to make there is that these I call them grifter masculinity, because that's really what they are. These ideas have so little nuance. They're almost hostile to the idea of nuance. And, a really great example that has kind of been implied without, explicitly said is, the rise of Dagestani fighters. There's a lot of Dagestani fighters in the UFC, and a lot of them aren't that successful. The ones that are successful, ones like Habib and Mac, take a step back and look at their games. They're thoughtful, intelligent, well-considered approaches to fighting that are different. Like, people still continue to fucking say that Habib and Mac are the same fighter with the same threats, and they're not even close. Like, they don't even use their striking to set up their aggressive grappling games in the same way. But by reducing them to these creatures with no nuance who are excellent fighters because they're hungry and they come from the land of the savage mountain men, maybe rather instead than acknowledging that perhaps the environment they grew up in gave them some motivation, and that was combined with a fantastic gym environment, great teammates, specialized training and so on. We just end up in an environment where we find one thing, one reason that's sexy to us, that appeals to us, that fits what we already believe to be true, and we say, that's why that guy's a gun. Rather than, an approach of nuance and, of trying to be more scientific and realizing that everybody as a successful person is a combination of, hundreds, if not thousands, if not, arguably millions of factors all at play at once. And for me, that's kind of I think we're kind of moving into, the idea of manliness and the often mistold narratives about it. But I would say to anyone that's perhaps on the fence or not really sure how to recognize what is a grifter in the, masculinity sphere, how much nuance do they have? Because in the end, most ideas are complex. Like, Makachev came out and in many ways beat Chucky Olives, one of the best aggressive fighters I've ever seen, because he was insightful and intelligent enough to study him and find methods and approaches and ways of fighting on the back foot that also chained in his own grappling threats. Does that sound like savage mountain man, or does that sound like methodical, disciplined planning that comes from a team and preparation? So why is everyone that wants you to think he's successful because he's a savage mountain man telling you one story?
This is kind of endemic to this is just a good exemplifier of how endemic anti-intellectualism is in the combat sports sphere, because whenever I noticed this, whenever like someone posts bits of analysis online, usually what you face, for example, on Instagram, if you post a short breakdown of a fight on Instagram, of not even a fight, like a sequence. Here's a fighter throwing 1-1-2s. The first jab sets up. The first jab is a feint that sets up the second jab that connects, and then that second jab disguises the right hand that comes over the top, knocks out the other man. The comments are sometimes like, "Well, how do they do you actually believe that they are able to think that fast in a fight?" Like, obviously not. But that's those are the concepts that are allowed the knockout to happen, and that's the understanding of those concepts. That's why the fighter used the 1-1-2. It's
they trained it into their fists. Hajime no Ippo.
Yes, essentially, yeah. It's just the development of those fighting instincts through thoughtful training.
Yeah, there's to go back to Hax's point a little bit with Andrew Tate. He blew up on TikTok primarily, is kind of where his original superstardom spawned from, which, if you think about it for 5 seconds, means that all his ideas, these exciting apparently ideas to young men, could all be condensed into TikToks, which is a good example of why they probably are not good ideas. If everything you've ever said, every point you've ever made, every anecdote and piece of your philosophy can be shortened to that length and does not need any more clarification or extrapolation, is probably not someone you should be listening to. Ideas should be hard for you to grapple with. They shouldn't be easy answers. If you are listening to someone and everything they're saying seems like such a simple, easy solution or explanation, they're usually trying to get you to buy something. That's really it. They want you to buy something.
And it's insulting to people that put so much thought and craft into what they do. Habib's father, sit down and read a fucking interview with him. That man thought a lot. And I think one of the places in which he almost waxes lyrical, he gets almost quite philosophical about it, is when he talks about the importance of the gyms and the training and the structure and the positive examples of, being a man, being somebody who's an adherent of the faith, if applicable. He gets quite almost poetic about how important that stuff providing that stuff is for him to young men in the region. Like, it's the antithesis of grifter masculinity. It's of substance and value and thought. And I also really liked, Simon, that you pointed out that it's you don't just look at the solution, you look at the explanation behind it, because sometimes the solution or the explanation can be really, really easy, but the other part of it can be hard. It's very rarely when they're both simple. Because, sometimes the key to winning a fight, like if you're fighting somebody like Michael Johnson, your preparation for winning that fight is pretty simplistic. There's certain things you need to do and you're probably going to win. That doesn't mean that the ideas behind those simple things aren't themselves complex and nuanced and worth learning.
Yeah. When I just want to do that, I was thinking about this from the very beginning when we first had this idea, but I thought it was an important thing to clarify, which is that in almost all the cases that you'll see coming up, we don't personally know any of the people we're talking about, the good and the bad. And they're strangers to us. But because in the MMA sphere, there is a parasocial relationship with a lot of these people, and their lives and their philosophies and their actions are simplified and or not known about, we're going to use them as examples for certain traits or certain philosophies and outlooks. And there'll be some simplification in that. So when I'm talking about Sanctainoi, I've never met Sanctainoi. I don't know Sanctainoi's life, but I'm going to use him as an example of something. And I'm just looking for anyone listening to this to just focus on that example, to see what that can represent. Because obviously everyone's a very complicated person. Makhachev's complicated. Abdulmanap's complicated. Khabib's complicated. But when we use them as an example, we just want to use it to talk about a very specific thing.
So the narrative that we can glean from this is the simplification of ideas. The very good point about Andrew Tate becoming popular over TikTok. It's it's not so much condensation, because ideas can be condensed to like axioms. It's so long as you understand that the actual process behind coming to the conclusion that is presented to you was actually complex, and the process was very like intricate and involved a lot of thinking. But what we see now is shortcuts to essentially like finding who you are, shortcuts towards finding yourself, finding your identity, because it's always been like it's a lifelong pursuit, finding out more about yourself, understanding who you are. And to a lot of people, that seems like an intimidating prospect. So a lot of people flock to easy solutions, and that's where all grifters, not just masculinity grifters, make their buck. It's always this number one trick to losing weight, this number one trick to gaining lots of muscle really quickly, this number one trick to getting lots of dates going on, or buying a new car, or getting lots and lots of money. And it's never the real answer to all those problems is always like something boring, something mundane, or something that involves a lot of work, something that requires lots and lots of sacrifice when it comes to your free time or effort, or just any number of things. And people don't want that, especially frustrated people towards whom the content is aimed, like the people at whom the content is aimed. And it's I can understand why people flock to it. I can understand why people just latch onto these ideas, but at the end of the day, it's just false. They're just falsehoods. They're lies. They're not solutions in any way. They're just, if anything, they just lead you to, if anything, they're just dead ends. They do not leave any room for improvement. They do not leave any room for experimentation or errors. It's always do this unless you want to miss out. And if you do this, you're going to be successful and handsome, have lots of girls and have lots of cars just like me. And that just that alone is just a giant red flag, but not a lot of people recognize it, unfortunately.
Yeah, to reiterate on a point is that identity, it's a tool. You identify with some kind of traditional role, some kind of teacher, student, husband, wife, child, cousin, whatever, and you're telling something to someone about yourself when you identify yourself as these things. And it's the same thing with a man, right? But when your ideas of what a man are broken and simple, then the way you will be living your life will be broken and simple or destructive. And the reason I think, which is what you said, that this is the answer for what masculinity is to so many people, is because they're easy, and it's hard to think about these things sometimes. It's hard to know yourself and to know how you should act. You say, well, I'm a man, I feel like a man, I feel masculine. And these are the people who say that they're the most masculine. So I guess I should be like them. I should try to act like they do. And that's how you end up in this idolization of all of those. Really, what we talked about was the fake ideas of traditional masculinity, not things that really adhere to the reality of the role of men or of masculinity.
Yeah, to talk briefly about the role of men in societies. Like it's not a set thing. It's not a one thing that is just this is what a man is, and it's been that way for for thousands of years. It's not. It's just like any
it's contextually
role.
Dependent.
Yeah, it's contextually dependent on culture, region, historical period, the circumstances,
an individual.
Yeah. And for example, the commonality between, for example, the return to tradition movement in the West is for example, the Hellenic or / Greco-Roman ideal, and all these Greek bust avatars on social media that you see talking about how that's when men were really men, and they very selectively and conveniently omit certain things that are uncomfortable to them about those ideals. Like, for example, the Greeks were gay as shit. They were really, really gay. Just because, there were different types of love that they espoused, which was the familial love towards your comrade, and not actually love towards a woman, because they were insanely misogynistic. Love towards another man and gay sex with underage boys were the height of true passion and manliness for the Greeks. And this is something that's these return to tradition guys really, really do not like acknowledging. Recently, we have a Discord community, which you should join, by the way, listeners. But we recently had a guy join us, and we started talking about how the Greeks were actually really, really gay. And he got so mad. He got so angry that he started linking different videos from weird kooky channels that talk about how the Jews and reptilians actually run the world, and said that Well, no, don't look at all the other stuff. Don't look at all the other videos on this channel. Look at this video on this that says that the Greeks weren't actually gay, because he cites lots of interesting sources. And like, you look at the sources, and the sources are just like, trust me, bro. Just
I mean, another point is that the Greeks were defeated, and their great rival, the Persians, were defeated by somebody who, you know, a fair number of sources theorize was bisexual, who forced marriages between Persian women and Greek men, and who ran an empire that was remarkably cosmopolitan, globalist, and as it moved on and on and on, increasingly, you know, recruited Persians as, you know, professional soldiers. So, like, it was anything but the kind of, you know, Hellenistic, monocultural, anti-globalist, you know, ideal. It was, you know, Alexander the Great was probably the closest thing to a globalist of his time in many ways.
What's interesting, and just to elaborate a little bit, why were the Greeks defeated in the first place? Because, like, Alexander the Great first actually had to conquer Greece, right? And what separated his soldiers, Macedonian soldiers, from the other Greeks who considered the Macedonians to be barbarians, for various cultural reasons, like one of them being that they drank undiluted wine. just a funny aside, but everyone likes to think about the Greeks like they were these ideal, perfect warriors that spent their whole life training. And that was only true for the Laconians, the Spartans. And even then, it's a warped perception. It's a perception that was mostly cultivated by things like the 300, the movie, or the comic book by Frank Miller, where they are portrayed that way. Whereas in actual Greece, at the moment, there was a culture of not so much intellectualism, but rather amateurism when it comes to warfare. The ideal Greek male was a citizen soldier, and what that meant was, when war came, he would join, he would grab his stuff, he would buy his own equipment, and then just kind of like join a citizens' militia. Because that's what the Greek armies were. They didn't drill, they didn't train specifically to be soldiers, they just kind of like grabbed their spears and just had a big shoving contest every once in a while. And the idea was, if you feel like you need to train for warfare, if you feel like your skills or rather spirit is lacking, then that's just a signifier of your spiritual weakness. You don't have heart for it. The person who has the biggest heart should win in a war. That was the idea of Greek warfare before Alexander the Great, who actually it started with Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, who actually like looked at all this stuff and said, "This is, that's kind of stupid. We should
fucking amateur hour.
Yeah, we should train. We should drill stuff. We should have a professional standing army." And so they developed a professional standing army and kind of sort of steamrolled through the entirety of Greece. And then they decided to start conquering Alexander started conquering after his father got offed in an attempted coup.
Is this a history podcast now? Can we just go through? Can I talk about Cyrus the Great now?
Sometimes, Simon, you see a bunch of land and you're like, "It's mine now. I'm gonna start stabbing." Like, that's just how it goes. Like, it's just vibes. Okay, it happens.
What a wonderful way to sum up 8,000 years of human history.
I mean, yeah, it's just like followed by that. There's also the Deus Vult, who talk about the chivalric ideal and how the knights were actually the height of masculinity. And the reality was, knights were by and large like constantly drunk psychos that rampaged across the countryside and just burned villages and shit. And the chivalric ideal was something that cooked up by the Catholic Church to just keep those rampaging, constantly drunk psychos from pillaging and murdering at the drop of a hat.
I guess the kind of point here is, firstly, that a lot of what we tend to call honor, or the ideal of the way people should behave, tends to be a pragmatic summary, more pragmatic than you think, and often tied to pragmatic concerns of the time, often. And secondly, and I think equally importantly, a lot of what we assume history to be often functions on a time scale or has details that a lot of people aren't told. the specific details of. And there's a historian called Brett Devereaux. He runs a blog called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry. You already know what you're in for with that name. And he has a series that kind of tries to capture this called The Fremen Mirage. And he talks about the idea of how the Fremen from Dune are kind of held up as being these noble warrior savages, and that's why they conquered the entire empire, and everybody else was weak and water fat, and they were nihilistic and debauched and whatever. And he kind of breaks down that's not a summary of reality. It's never been a summary of reality. And anyone who's telling you that narrative is, to be blunt and explicit, they're lying to you. That's not how the world works. And I would wholeheartedly encourage anybody who listens to this to please at least read the first part of that series, because you will, I think, come out of it with some knowledge and also come out of it with a good set of tools to spot a lot of these grifters. I mean, hell, if you even think about it, look at a lot of the people in the American Republican Party that talk about going back to the golden era of the nuclear family in the 1950s as if that's some kind of God-given rule. The nuclear family as an idea didn't even start appearing in fucking books until the 1920s. It wasn't even a particularly common family unit until the 1970s. Yet we're supposed to see it as some kind of timeless logic according to a lot of these return to tradition type people. It's like, a lot of what people will tell you is solved history or settled history or the truth is often just them overstating one very small period, cutting it down to bite-sized chunks and telling you it was way simpler than it actually was. Samurai being noble warriors who never did anything dodgy being another great example of that.
I mean, just beyond that, the actual fact that there's the fact that the way of the warrior is, which is obviously the East Asian answer to the chivalric ideal, more specifically the Japanese answer to the chivalric ideal, it was a code of behavior enforced as a means of control over a social class with a monopoly on violence. It was established during a peacetime era, shortly after the Warring States period, and later weaponized by Meiji-era Japan, Imperial Japan, for propaganda purposes to ensure the loyalty of its citizenry as it went on its... just went conquering, essentially, towards Southeast Asia and other regions, nearby regions.
Meanwhile, anything written by a samurai at the time was basically How to Be a Backstabbing Fuck-Ass, the novel.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And basically, like, the stuff like Hakagure, the guide towards towards developing the warrior soul. It's basically like a code of behavior that says, oh, if for example, if someone tells you this, you stab them. If someone tells you that, you bow to them, etc., etc. How to drink tea properly, that kind of stuff. It's not just a big book of how to become, one with the force or anything like that. It's basically just a code of behavior, and that just tells you something about the fact that maybe these ideas that we develop in our society, societal roles and societal measuring sticks by which we ascertain someone's fitness to be a good member, an upstanding member of society, are just that. They're just arbitrary standards that we came up with in order to have some form of functioning social contract and nothing more. But what these people would try to tell you, that this was something that is set in stone, something that is either dictated by biology or thousands of years of history that never changed. It's something that never changed. It's not fluid. It's just a static thing that simply is. And that's one of those, and that's just another one of those simple answers. Because the static idea, a static idea is easier to wrap your brain around as opposed to something that changes over time. And it's just, what can I say?
I'll tell you what Simon's about to say. He's leaning back in his chair like they don't know how much I'm going to talk about Muay Thai.
That's exactly it right now. Yeah. I would. Do you want to move the discussion onto examples of masculinity in combat sports?
Sure, why not? I mean, after all, it's ostensibly it's still a combat sports podcast. So there we go.
Yeah, we could go on about history for another 50 minutes if you really like. Yeah, okay. Do you want me to start? I can start with it. Yeah. I want to talk about a guy named Sang Tai Noi. You might have heard of him. He's a legendary Thai boxer. He fought in Muay Thai for a very, very long time. He was a Lumpini boxing champion. He was a Rajadamnern champion. I get all these pronunciations wrong. Forgive me. But the reason I wanted to talk about Sang Tai Noi is his in-ring persona and his perspective on fighting, which, if you don't know, his nickname was the Deadly Kisser, which is very odd in a way. He would kiss his opponent after their fight, and not aggressively, not in a dominating way. It was a very kind of tender, sweet, cute kiss on the cheek. You can find photos of this. And it really goes to show his specific perspective on fighting, which is that greatness and joy and success in fighting comes from compassion. He loved Muay Thai deeply. You can listen to him tell the story on YouTube of seeing the men from the local gym just doing their run, which is the worst part of training Muay Thai, is when your coach says, "Okay, everyone, let's go for our run." Just terrible. I hate it deeply. But he saw these men doing this, and he said, "Oh, I want to do what they're doing." He went to the gym. He trained. His mother was deeply disapproving of it. His father less so, but his mother deeply disapproving of it. He lost his first 5 fights when he was about 14 years old. But he didn't care. He loved the sport, and he loved fighting, and he loved expressing himself through that, and he loved his opponents. That's why you could say a form of love for his opponents, which is where the kiss comes from. The act of the combat, the training is what it comes from. He's not a fighter who fought out of rage or out of insecurity. He fought out of compassion. And that's what allowed him to be great, in my opinion. And he was great. He's, I think, one of the greats of the golden era, which has many greats, but he's my personal favorite. And it really just kind of blows up the whole idea that you have to fight in that certain way. You have to have that specific, violent, strong mentality to be skillful, to be successful. The way he fought is he kind of anti-fought in a lot of ways. He was incredibly hard to kick cleanly, just amazing kick defense. He had quite good boxing defense, a well-rounded skill set, and he was a bit of a just vibes fighter in a lot of fights. He kind of let his opponent take it to where they want, and then specifically took away their tools in a quite beautiful way. And it really fits with that kind of the mentality he had towards fighting. It's very interesting because in Thailand there's quite a lot of what you might call misogynistic attitudes in the fighting space, and a lot of nationalistic attitudes in this fighting space about foreigners and about tradition. But again, we see his mentality towards his masculinity take root there, because he fought many foreigners. He was always open to fighting foreigners. Danny Bill, Ramon Deckers. And he taught foreigners, specifically probably one of the most famous foreigners, John Wayne Parr. He taught. He was great friends with many people who would come to Thailand to train with many foreign fighters. He had a bit of a rivalry, of course. It's fighting. They're trying to knock your head off, and you're trying to knock their head off. But just always an incredibly friendly person to outsiders, looking to teach, to spread his knowledge, his skills, his style. He opened up his own gym. He had his own students. He was quite a good coach, from my understanding. And if you look at his life, which tragically ended in a suicide, it's one where he seems to have such a positive impact on everyone around him, and has left this this ingrained image of this compassionate, intelligent, friendly, lovable man. And it's all because, really, his strong mentality and being unafraid to show this kind of love and compassion and openness that was built into his style, his name, and the legacy he left. And this was, I think, one of when I thought of this topic, it was like, what's the most beautiful story I could tell of a positive male role model in combat sports? And Sanctinoy is, to me, exemplary. So that was my 6 minutes, I think, or whatever it was, 10 minutes maybe.
I mean, it's hard to top that, but I think that, like, I feel like we're kind of starting to talk in circles, because the point here is that, I mean, masculinity is multifaceted. And
yes.
Identities are multifaceted, and the ways that in which we can present ourselves to the world can be just as varied as people themselves. Every person is different, and that interplay of interpersonal relationships and our surroundings and ourselves are what creates actual, identities and real selves, as opposed to this one thing that defines you, this a couple traits that you should have in order to be a real such and such, in order to be a real, I don't know, fucking plasterer or something.
Yeah, it's about finding the traits that work for your conception of yourself. If you identify as masculine, well, what does being masculine mean to you? And because it's a tool, you need to find the things that will help you. So for Sanctinoy, it helped him to be a very relaxed and compassionate person. That helped him be a fighter. That helped him be a man. But that's not going to be for everyone in that specific way. But it's when you want to use it as a positive tool, you need to find the traits that you are going to associate yourself with, that you're going to live by, that you are going to try to fulfill the ideal of. And not the traits that are going to be self-destructive and externally destructive to those around you, the traits that people like Andrew Tate and Dana White
Speaking of Dana White and just narrow ideas, narrow perceptions of things, like the Power Slap League that we mentioned in the beginning, like, yeah, it's just such a pure distillation of everything that Dana White represents. It's just two guys just hitting each other as hard as they can with no ability to defend themselves. It's not even a sport in the sense that there's no skill involved. It's just who slaps hardest. It's just who can withstand the most amount of slaps.
I mean, let's be honest, the only thing that's not narrow about Dana White is his forehead. The guy can fuck right off, But to kind of fold both of your observations back, I mean, this just really highlights to me, you shouldn't trust somebody who sells you an idea of masculinity or anything in life, but in this context, masculinity is something that has no nuance. Is Simon's story the optimal way to be a fighter? No. I don't know. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say no. I should say I don't know if it is or isn't.
It worked for Sanctinoy.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. Yeah, is that there's a lot of ways you can be a fighter. You don't just have to be a violent hateful man. You don't have to be Tom Hardy in Warrior, running into the cage, picking someone up and slamming them, and then going to yell at your abusive father. You don't have to be some crazy wacko who drives your car into people.
And so when somebody tells you the only way to get ahead, the only way to beat the Matrix or, whatever, is to be a very specific type of person and behave a very specific way, those are the people you shouldn't trust. Those are the people who are trying to sell you something. I mean, another classic example is Usyk.
Yeah, that's
what an adorably dorky man. He seems to spend half of his time either running around saying crazy, Christian phrases or embarrassing his wife in public. And yet, I mean, look what he does with his hands.
He got them hands.
Also hobbed up. Have you seen the photo of him chopping wood? Just
okay,
cockwatch. Cockwatch.
This is not the cockwatch.
I mean, just look seriously. Whoever's listening to this, look up Alexander Usyk chopping wood.
So
the secret to having a big penis is to scream at people saying "Hey, Derek" while running across a beach.
Yes, but anyway, just to go on another historical tangent, the power slap. I've been thinking about this for a while now. The power slap league kind of reminds me. I mean, obviously, the example that I'm going to bring up is slightly more nuanced and slightly more, refined in a way, but it's very similar. Lots of when people think about old-timey Germany, what they think about the ideal Prussian soldier, the stoic Prussian man, and one of the things that was a big during the heyday of the Kingdom of Prussia was the imperial academic Mensur fencing, it was exactly as what it says on the tin. It was popular in academic circles, and the sole purpose was to prove your manliness by withstanding numerous cuts to the face. And the scars were rubbed with abrasive materials to make sure they were suitably impressive and rugged looking afterwards. And such fencing was mostly practiced by aristocrats, or people wealthy enough to be enrolled in Imperial German colleges, Imperial German military colleges, or otherwise. So, they weren't actually, training to be battlefield soldiers that would engage in sword fights. It was during an era where firearms already ruled the battlefield. And such fencing served virtually no combat utility, outside of perhaps helping develop pain tolerance, maybe coordination, and maybe some familiarity with the sword in a very narrow context.
It's kind of like a useless masculinity. It doesn't even... It's not even entirely destructive. It's just kind of pointless. This Prussian society, has totally kind of lost whatever ideal they had, whatever the association of masculinity was. Well, yeah, unlike the photo of Usyk's penis, I will tell people to go and look at YouTube videos of this fencing, because it's kind of unbelievable how silly it looks. And you can kind of look back and guess at how it came to this, where it's these elite Prussian men who have this strong ideal of masculinity's association with violence and injury, but their lives don't match this ideal whatsoever. So they must simulate it so that they can have the appearance that their lives are parallel or that are, part of this ideal, right? They simulate the sword fight, they simulate the injury, they have the scars, and it really shows that, how the persona, the tool, the identity of masculinity, if you're not even working hard to get an ideal, even if it's a negative ideal, it just becomes like this weird kind of strange, self-destructive, pointless activity. And there's Nazis who have these scars, and you can make a strong relation between Nazism, fascism, and these pointless dead-end ideals that these men had around masculinity.
Yeah, and did this style of fencing help develop character of those men that later went on to fight in world wars, both world wars? Did it transfer to their ability to perform on the battlefield as combat officers? It also kind of like probably not.
I mean, the time spent getting your face cut up is time not spent if you're going to be a leader of men, studying logistics maps or training how to lead a squad of men that trust you so that they don't get blown up, Like, it's not just that these things can often result in negative outcomes. That's, of course, a very valid point. It's that these things become distractions from, to use what is kind of a Zoomerism, touching grass, actually doing practical things that benefit you and the community around you. A lot of, like any social posturing, a lot of, I'm very masculine can become performative rather than substantive. And if you're in a high social class, or you're in a class that is kind of, I suppose, protected against competition, that can work for a while, right? But when it comes along that you have to actually do something that is objective and real and requires things like technique, you suddenly become a fearsome dictator who everyone is supposed to be terrified of, but you're doing push-ups and your arms are bowing out at the sides. I wonder who possibly could have done that.
So I'm going to steal the point that Tuman was going to make, which is that if you've seen the fencing and you think it looks stupid, if you've seen, these dumb rich men or these these kind of middle class people trying to make themselves look strong and masculine, but they're not actually training any skills, they're just injuring themselves. If you've seen these and you think it looks stupid, and then you watch footage of guys in MMA gyms training their chin by getting punched really hard, and you think that looks cool, you need to correct yourself there, because they're the exact same thing. When you see dumb idiots getting, their coach to wallop them in the face, over and over to make them tougher, it's like a modern form of the Prussian fucking face fencing. It's pointless. It indicates a kind of lost, stupid idea of a masculine trait. It doesn't help you at all, and it's a waste of time while people are properly training and getting better and getting more skills, and you are trying to look tough, right? It really is the modern day version, is this idea around toughness training where we're gonna, hit you with a bat to make you stronger. You were gonna, and I love Tony Ferguson, but we're gonna kick a steel pipe and make our legs bleed. Tony Ferguson's gone through a lot of injuries. It's not a coincidence with the way he trains. A lot of it is training to look cool on camera. Or, well, not really cool, but he thinks it looks cool when he does like a flip off a big tire. But it's really just risking injury, and it's not helpful.
It is really grifter masculinity. Like, that's why I call it grifter masculinity, because it's not just that it's not just that it comes... It's ineffective. It often comes at a cost to you. The same way,
detriment.
Like CoffeeZilla's expose on Tate's what was it called, Hustler University. You're paying a lot of money for stuff that you could learn for free,
and stuff you don't really want to learn most of the time, anyways.
A good recent example, like just the most recent example, something that's actually directly affected the quality of my life, is Russia's. The hyper-masculine army of Russians invading the them-ours Ukrainian forces, and like American chimpanzees were just rampaging around on the internet, buying into Russian propaganda and believing that the US military is being turned into an army of rainbow-haired pansies, while completely disregarding reality.
8 HIMARS later.
I mean, yeah, just look at the just damage reports and everything. Like, the hunky Russian bears are basically getting their back blown out by a recently mobilized civil defense force, motivated by the fact that they're fighting for their homes, and supported by the woke industrial giants of gay rope in the United Communist Republics of America. just all this posturing. Ramzan Kadyrov doing dog shit push-ups, getting 0 reps in, 0 quality reps in on live television.
It's never going to stop being hilarious.
And all those commercials where the grrr, angry Russian man just crawling through the mud and shaving using cutting axes and all those other stupid shit that they're putting out on TV and people buying into it. The reality spells are just the reality is completely different. The reality, I mean, obviously, like practice has, to paraphrase Perun, a military analyst on YouTube, practice has a habit of beating up theory and taking its lunch money, and this is what we're witnessing right now. And this just demonstrates the disconnect between what's being a man and being an effective soldier or whatever actually is versus what all these people would like you to believe.
If I may make a point that kind of gets repeated in economics, like a lot of the people that are selling you a grift that isn't based in reality, you've got to ask the question, if this thing comes at a cost to them, right? Like ineffective self-defense tactics or, dating techniques that don't work or investment techniques that lose people money. If they're actually following the advice they're giving you, usually they're not, but sometimes they are. The fact that they're able to be successful or appear to be successful while using ineffective strategies tells you one of two things. Either they're already doing so well in life that they don't have to pay the cost of using shitty ideas, or there's something else going on that makes their shitty ideas effective for them, right? Like, a lot of what Andrew Tate talks about with effective defense and so on, and what he thinks is the right approach to learning striking, how much of that would actually hold up if he stepped into the ring against a top 10 or top 5 pound-for-pound kickboxer without any significant weight advantage or disadvantage? Well, I mean, if you check his kickboxing history, you'll know, and it didn't go well for him. Like, reality has a way of kicking the door down on pretense.
Yeah, I mean, he also thinks BJJ can't work, and there's black belts who would just get on top of him and break his arm so easily. Yeah. But to talk about Kadyrov, I wanted to talk about his specific relation to masculinity in combat sports and not get crazy deep into it because it's a very complicated situation with Russia and Chechnya and the Ukraine. But the shorthand that MMA is used as for masculinity, its association with traditional masculinity, means that these people like Kadyrov who want to appear like strong, powerful, masculine men try to build up this relationship with combat sports by having Kamaru Usman, Justin Gaethje, Khamzat Chimaev come and hang out with their son and hang out with them and shoot guns with them, right? They know that these men have a very strong association with what most people think of as masculine. So they end up, trying to orbit around them, right? Trying to build up this association. And because people have parasocial relationships and have idealized relationships with these fighters, they then, believe this is true. They believe these Russian fighters, these Chechen forces are some kind of powerful, strong, robust military, when it's not true, right? And it shows how vapid these connections are, and that there really is no, you can't force a connection with any of these ideas. You can't just say, well, I hang out with these people, they're my friends, they're whatever, therefore I am, and therefore my army is, and therefore, you're not going to be Justin Gaethje because you pay him money to come to your ranch and shoot some rifles. It doesn't make you Justin Gaethje.
And it's insulting to all the work that Justin Gaethje put into being such a fucking himbo.
Yeah, it's true. It took a lot of shots to the head to be like that. That was mean. I'm sorry, Justin.
It's all right. He's a Labrador. Just throw him a ball and he'll bring it back to you, wagging his tail. Maybe like part of the reason why Justin Gaethje changed his style was that they were playing catch with Trevor Whitman, and Trevor Whitman accidentally threw the ball too far, and Justin Gaethje just ran into an ice cream truck. So, so maybe Trevor Whitman is to blame, but for a different reason. I think obviously we can just continue coming up with more and more examples. Where do I even try and go from here? It's just that it's such a vast, expansive topic, and I feel like you can spend an entire series examining it.
I mean, I would like to try and capture it. All right, so my example is pretty simple, but it's a perfect example of the kind of anti-intellectualism of the time that we exist in the MMA space. That I've seen this discussion happen so many times. People will say something along the lines of, "You shouldn't hit a woman." And then people will go, "What do you mean? What if she's attacking you? What about equal rights? Equal rights for equal lefts." And it's I feel like, okay, so the you shouldn't hit a woman in a combat sports context. Let's actually unpack what that means, because I don't think it's that complex, but for some reason people don't want to say it explicitly. 99 times out of 100, men are physically stronger than women. So they have an advantage. They have power over women, right? That's just a practical reality. If you exist in a combat sports sphere, firstly, because there's a lot more men in combat sports. Secondly, because if you think about combat sports training as a kind of multiplier to your natural athletic attributes, the power differential between a man who exists in combat sports and a woman is even greater, right? So you shouldn't be hitting women because you shouldn't be using physical force on somebody who's just not a threat to you because of that power differential. Now, if that person becomes a threat to you because they grab a knife or a gun, then we're dealing with a different situation, but we shouldn't need to go through every fucking exception to establish a general rule. None of this is particularly controversial. None of this is particularly hard to understand. And when somebody says you shouldn't hit a woman, I feel like it's pretty fucking obvious that all of what I've just unpacked is included in the discussion, right? And not just that, but if you do need to defend yourself, there's the idea of proportional force. If an angry woman comes up at you at a bar and starts trying to hit you, you don't need to start punching her face in, restraining her, stepping away, disengaging. There's 1,000,001 options that are between nuclear force, full escalation, all of your combat potential, in quotes, and defending yourself, right? But that's the danger with anti-intellectualism, because we can get to a point where you start expecting people who are, defending their position or establishing their position, you start throwing gotchas at them, equal rights for equal lefts. So it's but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about specific situations with specific contexts, with specific environments. So to tie that all back to MMA, the Dana White situation. Dana, I don't know if he does combat sports training or not, but I know he's twice the fucking size of his wife. The guy does steroids out the asshole. Are you seriously going to try and tell me that when he's got, when he's controlling her hands and so on, as Moni pointed out on Twitter, her slapping him is somehow such a massive escalation and such a massive threat to him that he's fully justified slapping her back? Get the fuck out of here. Come on. That's not proportional at all. And if you don't know what the term proportional means or how it applies, you're probably concerned trolling or sea lining at this point.
It's disingenuous too, because it's not like the people who defend Dana White believe that it was self-defense. They're just kind of in love with the idea that they get to hit a woman. They say, they have all this pent-up frustration that has been exacerbated by grifters towards women. And they're looking for a situation in which they can either justify themselves doing it or get to vicariously, justify.
Yeah, it's the joy they have. When escalating violence, it should never make you happy. It's not a good thing.
We should. I'm glad we came to this point, because we should make really clear in this whole discussion, misogyny, the way women are talked about in the MMA space, the violence towards women, it's disgusting. It's defended just a troubling amount. People who are doing it need to just completely reevaluate their perspective on people and individuals. And you need to learn to be a much more compassionate and thoughtful person. Because if you live your life like this with a rage and a kind of like seething joy in the conflict and in the violence. It's not gonna work out for you, and it's not gonna work out for anyone else. You need to move on from that. Hopefully part of this discussion was convincing that it's not the right way to be thinking, but ultimately it's on the people who act like that to change. And the way it is now is it can't stay like this, because the way the community has been and the way fighters have been in reaction to a lot of this is it's so immature, it's so ignorant, that serious self-reflection needs to be done. People are kind of like looking for guidance, right? And they're looking for some kind of identity signifier that they feel like can allow them to, get on the path to the life they want, right? This is a view that a lot of people have. It's like, there's a place I want to be. There's a person I want to be. I'm not there yet, but I need to get on the path to being that person, right?
Are you outraged at the world around you? Do you think that everyone is out to get you? Well, yes, it is I, rich person who's probably the same skin color as you. I've got a solution to your every problem. You need to do exactly what I say. Never question me. Follow every single part of my thing. And consider everybody else who disagrees with me your enemy. Oh, and by the way, give me money!
If your identity, the tool you're using to self-direct, is based off of the outlook, philosophy, opinions of just completely morally despicable sex traffickers, not only are you not going to get there, but you're going to fail yourself as well. And it's going to exacerbate all of the problems that are preventing people from self-actualizing, from getting to places they want to be, from becoming the person they want to be. So if you're going to use your identity, if you're going to have, a strong sense of self because you think it will help you to be a fulfilled person or to help your community, then make sure the things you are associating yourself with, your sense of self, just don't be, it's going to sound stupid, don't base it off of what sex traffickers say. Don't base it off of what, criminal combat sports athletes say. Base it off of people who have positive life examples and legacies and histories.
Sriram said it the other day in a conversation, in a private conversation, like the least manly thing in the world is to just try to just go out of your way and rip your asshole in half to try and be more manly.
If you're trying to force something, you're not. And specifically, you're trying to force it in this very shallow way, then who you are will become shallow.
Yeah, it's like if you let somebody else do all of the thinking for you as to what you should be, then what is left of you that's actually you, really? Like for me, that's it. And the other part is to again go back to what I've brought up a few times. If the person that's telling you what you need to be or how to get ahead is telling you a story with no nuance, if they're saying the only way to be successful is to be what I say is successful, that's a warning sign. Because I'm going to track back to something that I think that almost every single person in MMA, left or right, up or down, any country, any faith, ethnicity, whatever, would agree on. One of the great things about MMA is that it's a combination of all styles, and that we've seen just about every single different type of fighter win a title. Hell, even within guys where if you're very superficial, you might say they're the same, like Mac and Habib, you can see a tremendous breadth and depth of difference within their styles. So if you can be a world champion at mixed martial arts, fighting in so many different ways, or to put it another way, if there's more than one way to be one of the greatest fighters of all time, why isn't there more than one way to be a man?
So just really, really to just hammer it home. what is currently being promoted in the combat sports space is it's all about the easy way out. Top 10 tips to boost testosterone, do this one thing to conquer the world, the get rich quick scheme for personal fulfillment. And it reinforces just a zero-sum picture of the world, where someone stands to gain and all others stand to lose. And this is just the natural order of the world to them, and you gotta scramble to become the winner so you can enjoy the spoils of the victory you've brought for yourself through the misery you brought upon everyone else. And because history is written by the winners, and therefore winning absolves you of all responsibility, that means you don't have to change. You don't have to improve or be considerate of others. Just do these top 10 tips, and this is your carte blanche to remain a piece of shit. And to just much like all these societal roles, and a lot about the masculine myth and what they're selling is just arbitrary, quote unquote, done things, and they're even more shallow than the societal roles that we just place upon ourselves. All these identifiers, like, are there biological reasons for human behavior? Sure, just look at the way our brains work. Like our brains are pattern recognition machines. They come in with built-in heuristics to make us act fast and think fast in order to not be eaten by predators. However, all these same mechanisms also lead to all sorts of biases and wonky irrational judgments, because our brains aren't created to help us solve logical problems. They exist to help us not be eaten, find food, mate, raise offspring, and that's it, just like any other animals. Does it mean we have to give up on rationality? No. Does it mean our subconscious dictating our behavior in all sorts of subtle ways is the end-all be-all, and whatever heuristic non-logic we come up with is actually the objective truth, like the Ben Shapiro's of the world would like us to believe when they engage in magical thinking and call it facts and logic? Fuck no. Ideals and traditions are mechanisms of enforcing some form of societal order. Ideals and traditions evolve over time, and falling back on it's the done thing, especially when you misinterpret the done thing, or the reasons why it was the done thing, is lazy. And it's the coward's way out of being a decent human being. You have a brain, fucking use it. That's it. That's my that's my 2 cents on this whole situation. All right.
Very good. I liked it. That was a good talk.
It was a bit disjointed, probably more disjointed than
it was.
Should have been, but at least we covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover for this.
Yeah.
I guess which is.
I think it's a little bit okay that it's disjointed, because I think the people listening to this, it's a little bit of like an idea bubble, or like an idea web, where you're just kind of branching out, and it's good to like bring up like a fighter, and then you can connect it back later instead of making it also like chronological, right?
There's so many examples, and they're all uniquely terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic. It's so hard to do in like,
To be honest, I think one of the problems with running this discussion is that, like, every single time we've been like, okay, we've got everything we need to say, some other misogynist is like, da-da-da-da-da, Super Smash Bros. Music, a challenger appears, like every time we were like, okay, we've hit all the topics, some other dumbass would do something new. Oh, Chris Curtis, it's time for him to give his opinion, and then we have another thing we have to talk about.
I mean, to Chris Curtis's credit, he actually, condemned.
Yeah, that's true.
Some of the things that happened recently.
Honestly, he's probably like in the 95th percentile.